Okay, so our talk tonight is on the typology of the Exodus and the Passover. And so this beautiful timing with the liturgical season, because a week ago Monday Israel celebrated the Passover, and then in Holy Week we read these passages that we'll comment on Holy Thursday and on the Easter Vigil on Saturday night. And in the liturgy of Holy Week, the Passover is absolutely central. It comes up again and again in the readings of Mass, in the Divine Office, in the readings from the Fathers in the Divine Office, commenting on the events of Holy Week. And so we can say that Exodus is perhaps the most typological part of the Bible. It's the center of the typology. And that's why the Church's liturgy makes it so central in Holy Week, and especially in the most solemn liturgy of the whole year, which is the Easter Vigil, with its 7 readings from the Old Testament. And of those 7 readings, one of them is precisely the crossing of the Red Sea. And on Holy Thursday, we read Exodus 12, which we'll look at in just one second. Okay, so the prelude to it is the bondage of the chosen people in Egypt. And that we have to take, first of all, as an historical fact. Right? The chosen people was in Egypt for some 400 years. And at the end of that time, it became an oppression and a bondage. But there's a moral typology here, and that's a typology of bondage that's temporal, bondage to Pharaoh, as a type of bondage to sin. And so the bondage of Israel in Egypt is a type of what we all experience. Mankind universally after original sin, and each of us in bondage to our personal sins. And the more those sins predominate in our life, the harder becomes the bondage. And the more we become enslaved. No, and everyone experiences that. We each experience in our own life that every time I give into a particular sin, that sin becomes master progressively with each time I do so. So the house of bondage was a historical reality, temporal bondage, but a type of spiritual bondage that is of every man. And then the plagues also have that same typological dimension. So the 10 plagues worked by Moses, on the one hand, historical events, and historical events done precisely to be a motive of credibility to God's revelation. So God worked those 10 plagues so that Pharaoh would believe and let them go, but more importantly, so that Israel would believe in the Lord. And so the 10 plagues, and then the crossing of the Red Sea, all of that is to prepare Israel to believe 50 days later when they get to Mount Sinai. Right? So that they'll believe God's revelation, and that the plagues being the sign of the truth of God who speaks. And so the 10 plagues, we should think of the 10 commandments. Right? The 10 plagues prepare for the reception of the 10 commandments. So that would be the historical dimension, that Moses worked those plagues. And when Moses was still before Moses came back to Egypt, when he was still in Mount Horeb, and he spoke with God in the burning bush, God gave him the commission, to go back to Egypt and to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And so what does Moses ask? He asks 2 things. He asks for God's name. God gives him his name. But he also asks for a sign, because he says, Pharaoh's not going to believe me if I say, let my people go. And so God says to him, what's that you have in your hand there? The rod. And so his staff, and he throws it on the ground, it becomes a serpent. Right? And that, basically God was telling Moses that the signs that he worked in Egypt would be what would convince Pharaoh and the elders of Israel that God was speaking through him. Right? And so in that sense, we can take all the 10 plagues as motives of credibility. But they're also types in the same way that we said before. So the 10 plagues are consequences of the bondage and of Pharaoh's hardness of heart in not hearing God's word. And so we can see the plagues as types of the consequences of sin. And again, everyone experiences this in their own life. That to the extent that we sin, there are plagues that we experience, that are interior. And the greater the sin, the greater the plague that follows. And so we may often we're tempted to think God is punishing us, but the very plague is a good thing, right? Well, why is the plague a good thing? Because it leads us to believe in the word and to repent, right? And so the 10 plagues given to Pharaoh were God's mercy to him, right? To give him signs to believe. And likewise in our life, the plagues that come from sin are, in fact, signs of God's mercy, calling us to him. I forget exactly. One of the prophets, I think it's Amos, but it could be Hosea. God says through the prophet, I have called you through good things, through blessings, but also through penalties. Right? The penalties and the catastrophes and the plagues are salutary, because they call us back to God. And then the very kinds of plagues that God gives also show the reality of sin. So the plague of locusts, right? So much in our own life, the locusts eat up the good that we do. And one could go through all the different plagues and see how they represent, in some sense, consequences of sin. Right? And finally, the killing of the firstborn. And that would represent the killing of what's most precious in us, the soul and its eternal destiny. Okay, so we have the plagues as types of sin. Let's look now at the response. So before the Israelites are permitted to leave, the plagues have to work their full course, and it's only in the final plague that Pharaoh repents and lets them leave. And that becomes the point for the institution of the Passover. So God takes the plague and the penalty, the killing of the firstborn, and makes that the substance, as it were, of Israel's most important liturgical feast, the Passover. And so in order to protect the Israelites from the killing of the firstborn, right, they're to perform the Passover rite, which then carries on into the life of Israel to this day as Israel's most fundamental obligation before God, together with the Day of Atonement. And so we're given this in Exodus 12, the command. I'll just read the Exodus 12, verses 3 to 14. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, they shall take every man a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then a man and his neighbor next to his house shall take according to the number of persons. According to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs in the evening. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat them. They shall eat the flesh that night roasted, with the unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you upon the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall fall upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. So that's the fundamental text that we read in the liturgy last Thursday, in Holy Thursday. And then another element was added later. When the temple was built in Jerusalem, the lamb had to be sacrificed there in the temple of Jerusalem. And so since the temple has been destroyed, this part of the Passover can no longer be carried out because the lamb has to be sacrificed in the temple. And if there's no temple, there can be no sacrifice. So the rest of the Passover, Jews keep to this day. But that part, they can't keep. It's interesting to think about what this would have looked like, because it's easy to kind of read it and kind of pass over the spectacle. So if every household, every group of, say, 10, had to have a lamb sacrificed on the same day, in the same time of the day, the afternoon or evening of the 14th of Nisan, think how many lambs you would need. Right? So suppose there were the population of Israel at the time of our Lord was about maybe 1 million. And so you would, or more, probably more than that. And so you would need maybe 100,000 lambs sacrificed in the temple court in one afternoon. And all the blood collected and all of this would be impressed upon the minds of the people. Both the memory of the original Passover, but the significance pointing forward of it. Right? That blood is in for the forgiveness of sins.
All on the altar on the courtyard.
Yeah, in the courtyard of the temple.
One altar?
Oh, I don't know how they would have done it. I don't know. The Talmud gives details of how it would have been done. Even though the Talmud was written down centuries after the destruction of the temple, and they kept a memory of what they did when the temple still stood. And so it's all written down and preserved for us. But I don't know the details of it. But it's possible to find them out.
They'd have to roast all those lambs there.
Right, then each one would be taken home, to each family group. And now all of Israel had to come to Jerusalem. And so each family group would have to find a room in Jerusalem in which to do this. Right? And we see that in the Gospels, how Jesus provided for that which became the cenacle, the upper room, where he instituted the Eucharist. Right, so that's So let's look at the typology. So the Paschal Lamb is the center of this whole ritual, right? And continued to be the center of it until the temple was destroyed. But even today, one has to think of the Paschal Lamb as the center of every Passover celebration, even though the lamb can no longer be sacrificed and consumed. And it's interesting, so the lamb had to be perfect, without blemish, 1 year old, and it had to be taken care of from the beginning, but then brought into the house, as it were, on the 10th of Nisan, in preparation. So that's an interesting detail. Moses tells us, God told the people through Moses, on the 10th day of the month, they shall take every man a lamb, and then you shall keep it until the 14th day. Now, what's the reason for that? They were to take the lamb, as it were, into their house and keep it in preparation for then presenting it in the temple to be sacrificed, and then taking it home to... and there's no explanation given. But when we make a connection with the Lamb of God, Christ, in Holy Week, there's a magnificent correspondence. So the 10th would be 5 days before the 4 or 5 days before the Passover. And so if we count back, it would come out to Sunday if Passover is on a Thursday night. And so Christ, on the 10th of Nisan, enters triumphantly into Jerusalem, right, with the hosannas and so that would correspond to the lamb being taken into the house in preparation for the lamb's immolation on the 14th. And so Palm Sunday has a typological significance of Christ, the Lamb of God, coming in triumphantly to his household in preparation for his immolation on the Passover. And then we should think of Our Lady in this. No? So as the family tends the lamb from birth in preparation for it being their sacrifice after 1 year, we can think of Our Lady tending the Lamb of God from his birth in preparation for the lamb's immolation on Calvary, except in the fulfillment, it's not 1 year, but 33 years. But just as the 1 year is the perfect age for the lamb, so Christ's 33 years is the perfect age for a man. And then without blemish, obviously Christ, perfect man, perfect God, is without blemish in any way. And then even the detail about no bone being broken. And so the lamb had to be consumed entirely that evening, and no bone broken. And that, too, was realized in the fact that Christ on the cross he was pierced, but his legs weren't broken, as were the two thieves on either side. Another detail that would have seen that God didn't explain to the Israelites is the taking of the blood of the Paschal lamb and painting it on the doorposts. And so they had to do this as the sign for the angel, the destroying angel, not to destroy the firstborn of the Israelite houses. And so it's a kind of metaphorical. Obviously, God doesn't need blood painted on doorposts to know where he's to punish and where he's not. And so clearly there's a typology there, and that's the easiest for us to see. The blood of the lamb on the doorpost represents the blood of Christ applied to us. And the key point here is this, that Christ's offering, so in the Passover, first the lamb has to be sacrificed. The lamb then is cooked and consumed, cooked in fire, consumed, but the blood is taken and put on the doorpost so that the angel of death passes over. And that, by the way, is where we get Passover, the passing over of the houses that are protected by the blood of the Lamb. And so likewise, Christ needs to be immolated first, but that immolation isn't by itself enough, as it were, because his blood needs to be applied to us personally. In other words, Christ died for all men on Calvary. But it doesn't follow that all men are saved, because Christ's blood has to be applied to me. So just as the Paschal lambs in that first Passover didn't save everyone, but only the houses to which they were applied, likewise, Christ's sacrifice doesn't save universally, but only those to whom the sacrifice is applied. And how is it applied? Well, we know in reality it's applied through the sacramental system of the church, the 7 sacraments. And of those 7 sacraments, the most important is the Eucharist. And so, but baptism, confirmation, penance, etc., the 7 sacraments apply that blood to us. And so the painting of the blood on the doorpost was a kind of figure or type of the application of Christ's blood to us in the 7 sacraments, and above all, in the Eucharist. and even the very time. So that the Paschal lamb had to be sacrificed in the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. And Jesus was the afternoon and evening. And Jesus, he instituted the Last Supper in the evening of the 14th of Nisan. And he was crucified in the afternoon of the following day. And so I don't want to get into this, but there's an ambiguity about what day Jesus actually died on, whether it was the 14th or 15th of, I'm sorry, the 14th or 15th of Nisan. But anyway, be that as it may, it fulfills both the Last Supper and the crucifixion fulfill the Passover. Right? And in effect, they're one. No, because the Last Supper was making sacramentally present what the next afternoon he was going to physically accomplish, dying on the cross. The letter to the Hebrews in chapter 9 and verses 13 and 14 speaks how the sacrifice of Christ fulfills all the figures of the Old Testament. So especially the Passover lamb, but also all the other sacrifices. If the sprinkling of defiled persons with the blood of goats and bulls and with the ashes of a heifer sanctifies for the purification of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify your conscience from dead works to serve the living God. Okay, and then, so after the offering and the painting of the blood, the lamb has to be consumed. Right? And that, too, has a beautiful typology. Again, always pointing to the Eucharist. And so in the Passover, there's first a sacrifice, and then there's a banquet of communion. And so the Passover, which is it more? Well, today we think of a banquet, a meal aspect of the Passover, right? Because the Jews can't sacrifice anymore. But in the time in which the temple still stood, the Passover would have been first sacrifice and then meal. And so the first and perhaps most impressive event would have been the sacrifice of all those lambs in the temple court. And then the individual consumption by each household, which would... so we see two things, sacrifice and communion. And the communion, the partaking of the lamb by each household, would be precisely binding them together, but binding them together in receiving the fruit of the sacrifice. If there's no sacrifice, there can't be communion. So the Passover is first sacrifice and then a communion in receiving the victim that's been sacrificed. And so, likewise, the Eucharist is both of those things. First sacrifice and then communion. And perhaps today we tend to, most people I think, focus more on the aspect of communion in the Mass. People think of the Mass as fundamentally receiving the Lord, but that's incorrect. Right? The Mass is first and most importantly sacrifice. The Mass makes present Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. And only as a consequence of that sacrifice can we share in the communion that's been gained by that sacrifice. Communion with God, but because of that communion with one another, in the communion with God. And so the Eucharist is first and foremost a sacrifice. And precisely that sacrifice of Calvary. And because it's that sacrifice, it creates communion. And in other words, because it's the sacrifice that reconciled us with God, it can be then the vehicle for us to share in the fruits of it. And so both the Passover and the Eucharist are at one and the same time sacrifice and banquet of communion. But banquet of communion only because first sacrifice. But the communion part is really important because it's the whole people sharing in the fruit of that sacrifice. And what's the purpose of sacrifice? Making peace with God. And because peace is made with God, peace with one another. Right? And so that's why the Israelites had to celebrate this in their household, binding the household together and having each house be, as it were, a kind of image of the household of Israel. Right? And it's likewise the same in the Mass. When we receive communion, we should think we're not only receiving communion with the Lord, right? We are, first and foremost. But through that communion, we're receiving a communion with one another. And not just with those who are present there, but with the whole church. And so the Eucharist is that, it's the sacrament of the unity of the church. Oh, well, that's exactly what's expressed in the Passover. That the communion, in consuming that lamb together, one household, is a kind of image of the unity of the church. And the fathers bring this out. Saint Cyprian speaks about this. Back in the beginning of the 3rd century, or the middle of the 3rd century, he says, the rite of the Passover, this is on the top of page 4, the rite of the Passover contains nothing else in the law of Exodus than that the lamb which is slain in the figure of Christ should be eaten in one house. Right? Every lamb in one house. In one house you shall eat it, you shall not send its flesh abroad from the house. Why? Right? And so Cyprian explains, the flesh of Christ, the holy of the Lord, cannot be sent abroad, nor is there any other home to believers but the one church. This home, this household of unanimity, the Holy Spirit designates and points out in the Psalms, saying, God who makes men to dwell with one mind in a house. In the house of God, in the church of Christ, men dwell with one mind and continue in concord and simplicity. So the Passover is a kind of figure of that. But the Eucharist realizes it because the Eucharist nourishes us with charity by which we can live together in one house. Another aspect of the Passover is the unleavened bread and the cups of wine. And this, too, we can see today. It's easy to see. That points to the Eucharist. Right? But none of this was explained by God. No, and all of these elements pointing to something that was going to happen 1,400 years later, they were all simply given to Israel as her fundamental feast and inheritance. But it's only in hindsight that we see the meanings of them. So another huge part of the Passover was the unleavened bread. And this, too, had an historical origin. Because they had to leave in haste in the night, there was no time to leaven the bread. And so they had to have unleavened bread. But that was all part of God's providential plan to be a figure of the Eucharist. And so throughout the life of Israel, they have to remember that haste in leaving Egypt, by having 7 days of unleavened bread. And for the mother of the household, this is a very important part of the preparation for the Passover, to make sure that all the leaven is taken out of the house before the 14th of Nisan. In the Passover Seder, there's a custom that the youngest child in the family asks why we do this. And the father says, this is the bread of affliction that our fathers ate in Egypt. He who is hungry, come and eat. It's beautiful. There are two things there. So on the one hand, it's a memory of the past, of the leaving of the Exodus and the haste. But at the same time, he who is hungry, come and eat. And it's a figure of a better food. He was. We're hungry not just for bodily nourishment, but above all for spiritual nourishment that is realized in the Eucharist. And then the fact that it's unleavened is a natural sign of, it's used as a sign of simplicity of heart. Why is that? Because leaven makes the bread puff up, to rise. And so the puffing up is a natural symbol of hypocrisy, to be, a pride, to be puffed up in conceit. And so the unleavened bread is a sign of purity of heart, which is one of the effects worked in us by the Eucharist. But anyway, it's interesting that God wanted to have the Paschal lamb together with bread and wine. And so the Passover celebration centers on the lamb, but it's accompanied with matzah, and that's not a small part of the Passover. And then the meal is structured by 4 cups of wine throughout the meal. Now, we don't know that the Passover Seder, the way it's celebrated today, corresponds exactly to how it would have been in the time of Jesus. But it's very reasonable to think so, because of Jewish traditions are very faithfully kept. So it's very reasonable to think that the Seder today represents the fundamental structure of the Seder at the time of Jesus, and we don't know how much back beyond that. But in any case, the 4 cups of wine divide the Seder meal. So it begins with a cup of wine, an initial blessing, and then there's a second cup that's poured, and it's at that time that the youngest child asks, what's the meaning of this night? Why is this night different from all other nights? And so that's the occasion for the father of the family to explain the meaning of the Passover. And so in other words, the reference back to the first Passover. And there's the idea that everyone celebrates the Passover as if they were there. That in the Passover, you have to think, you too were in Egypt. Right? And that's a beautiful thing. That liturgy is always that way. When we celebrate the liturgy, we have to think we were there. Right? So, for example, Holy Week. We should think at all the events of Holy Week that we were spiritually there. And it's not just a metaphor, because in some sense we were there. We were there, at least in the mind and heart of the principal protagonist, Jesus. In other words, we were the reason why he celebrated the Last Supper. We were the reason why he went to Gethsemane. We were the reason why he was crucified and rose. Right? In any case, so that in the Passover, you think that you were there spiritually. And then after the telling of the story, there's the distribution of the matzah. So the head of the household takes the matzah, breaks it, and gives 1 piece to each one. That would have been the point at the Last Supper where Jesus said, "This is my body." And so he took something right out of the Seder that would have been celebrated every year and in every Jewish household to be the point of the institution of the Eucharist. And then at that point there would have been, they would have drunk the second cup, and there would have been the dinner, which would be the consumption of the Paschal lamb. And then after the dinner, there would be a third cup of wine, which is called the cup of blessing. And it would have been at that point that Jesus said, "This is the chalice of my blood, of the new covenant." And so how do we know this? From the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, he tells us, he mentions 2 cups of wine at the Last Supper. One before the meal, and then he has the institution of under the species of bread. And then he says there was dinner, and after the supper, he took the chalice and consecrated the chalice. In other words, it only makes sense. It seems strange at first sight when you read it. Why are there 2 cups of wine, and why is it only the second one that's coming after? Why is the institution of his body before dinner and his blood after dinner? Well, it fits into the structure of the Seder. And so you can see how the Eucharist is, as it were, framing he himself, who is the Paschal Lamb. He's the Paschal Lamb, and so he's using these 2 elements that surrounded the consumption of the Paschal Lamb to be the new Passover for his church. And St. Paul also refers to the chalice as the cup of blessing, the same name that Jews give to the third cup of wine that's drunk at the Passover Seder. And so Jesus is taking the figure and fulfilling the figure in the very... He's living the type, celebrating the Passover with his disciples, and realizing it and making it the reality that it was prefiguring in that same circumstance, right? In that same Passover supper. Okay, another detail, changing subject a little bit. Another strange detail of the Exodus story, of course, slightly before that, Exodus 11, the Lord says to Moses that before, in that day, but before the evening, before the celebration of the Passover, all the Israelites were to go to their neighbors, their Egyptian neighbors, and borrow things. So God says to Moses, "Speak now in the hearing of the people, and that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor jewelry of silver and of gold." And so this is the day before the Exodus. They're to ask these things, to borrow them, and then leave with them. And they did, no? And they left with that jewelry and gold that they borrowed from their neighbors. And some of it ended up in the golden calf. But most of it ended up in the Ark of the Covenant and the tent of meeting. And so it's strange. No, it's very strange. It looks as if God is commanding the Israelites to rob their neighbors under the pretext of borrowing. Perhaps they thought they could return what they borrowed, but God knew perfectly well that they wouldn't return what they borrowed. Now, obviously, God doesn't steal because the whole earth is His. He's not stealing if He takes from one and gives to another. But it's strange all the same. And so the fathers of the church, reading this text, they think there's got to be more to it than just some way of giving the Israelites some extra gold on their exit from Egypt. And they see it as having a typological significance, and a very important one. They apply it to the church taking from the cultures of the world whatever is good and valuable in the natural cultures of the world. So a prime example of this would be Greek philosophy. So the church fathers took Plato and Aristotle, which they didn't know anything about Revelation, Plato and Aristotle. They were using the natural gifts that God had given them of reason, and the church took those gifts of reason, Greek philosophy, to build up the church, to build up her theology. And so the church's theology has a foundation in Greek philosophy. And so the fathers of the church see this as justified by the type of the Israelites borrowing the gold and silver from the Egyptians to use it in the worship given to God. Because, and the idea would be this, what the Egyptians used for their idols, or even simply for their secular use, God wanted in the Ark of the Covenant and in the tent of meeting as to give Him glory. No, and that's a kind of type of what all cultural riches are meant to do. They're meant to find their full fulfillment, their full meaning in the church. And this is really important for all kinds of discussions about in culture. There are a lot of people who think that, just take an example, when Cortez and his men, when they colonized Mexico and the Aztec religion fell, and Our Lady of Guadalupe, Our Lady appears, and the 10 million Aztecs convert to Christianity. Many people see this as a kind of crime, that this natural patrimony of Aztec culture was destroyed, and instead we played kind of a cultural imperialism. We transplanted a European religion. But the fact is that in the faith, all the cultures of the world find their fulfillment, not their destruction. And so the same thing is true of whether it's Greek philosophy. The greatest flowering of Greek philosophy came in Thomas Aquinas, rather than simply in Aristotle. The greatest flowering of classical art came in Renaissance art. In other words, the treasures of the world brought into the faith. And so there's some interesting... Leo XIII was Pope at the end of the 19th century, and he was a great Pope with regard to Christian philosophy. He wrote his first encyclical on calling for a revival of Christian philosophy, which was precisely taking the best of Plato and Aristotle as it had been transformed in the Christian Middle Ages by people like Thomas Aquinas, and making that the basis of solving the modern problems. And so he uses this analogy of the borrowing the wealth of Egypt. So he says, it is most fitting to turn these truths, which have been discovered by pagan sages, it's on top of page 6, the first quote there. These truths which have been discovered by pagan sages, Plato and Aristotle, to the use and purposes of revealed doctrine, in order to show that both human wisdom and the testimony of our adversaries serve to support the Christian faith, a method which is not of recent introduction, but of established use, often adopted by the Holy Fathers of the Church, who would take Plato and Aristotle. What is more, those venerable men recognize a certain form and figure of this in the action of the Hebrews, who, when about to depart out of Egypt, were commanded to take with them the gold and silver vessels and precious robes of the Egyptians, that by a change of use, the things might be dedicated to the service of the true God, which had formerly been the instrument of superstitious rites. St. Gregory of Nyssa, one of the great fathers of the 4th century, he says that Christ commands someone who borrows from wealthy Egyptians to receive such things as philosophy, moral and natural philosophy, geometry, astronomy, dialectic, whatever else is sought by those outside the church, since these things will be useful when in time the divine sanctuary of mystery must be beautified with the riches of reason. What a beautiful idea, that just as the temple, building up or first the Ark of the Covenant, required the labor of some craftsmen who had learned it in Phoenicia and Tyre, etc. So the church's theology needs to be built up using things discovered outside of the church and before the church. And then he goes on, those who treasured up for themselves such wealth handed it over to Moses as he was working on the tent of mystery, each one making his personal contribution to the construction. It is possible to see this happening now. For many bring to the Church of God their secular learning as a kind of gift. And he gives the example of other fathers of the church. St. Basil, who acquired the Egyptian wealth in every respect during his youth. St. Basil went to Athens to study at the academy founded by Plato, 6 centuries earlier or more. Who acquired the Egyptian wealth in his youth and dedicated this wealth to God for the adornment of the church, the true tabernacle. And St. Augustine uses the same image. Any statements by those who are called philosophers, especially the Platonists, which happen to be true and consistent with our faith, should not cause alarm. Because there are a lot of people who are suspicious of using secular learning in the service of the faith, especially our separated brethren, our Protestant brothers and sisters. But it was back in the time of St. Augustine the same. It should not cause alarm, but be claimed for our own use, as it were from owners who have no right to them. Because everything that's true belongs, first and foremost, to God, and not to any particular school or culture. Similarly, all the branches of pagan learning contain not only false and superstitious fantasies, but also studies for liberated minds, which are more appropriate to the service of truth. We can see, can we not, the gold and silver and clothing with which Saint Cyprian, right? So he's mentioning various fathers of the century before him, with which Cyprian, that most attractive writer and blessed martyr, was laden when he left Egypt. Right? That would be at his conversion. Is not the same true of Lactantius and Victorinus, Optatus and Hilary? These would be the saints and fathers of the 4th century. This is what had been done earlier by Moses himself, whom it was written that he was trained in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. Right, and so by doing this, we build up the church on the one hand, and we also make more noble the cultures of the world by fulfilling them, as it were, in service to God. And so there's a benefit given to all, right? So there's a benefit given to the church from the different cultures of the world, but there's a benefit given back from the church to the cultures of the world, because those cultures are enriched by a light that is from above. Right? And so it's to everyone's benefit. No one loses by it. And it also helps the gospel to be enculturated, in every different culture. That the church takes what's best in that culture and uses it for the service of God. But you have to be careful. Right? So, and we see that in the Exodus as well. So some of that gold and silver ended up in the golden calf. And so some of the learning that we take from the cultures of the world can end up in golden calves. Just take an example. In 30, 40 years ago, it was very fashionable in some circles of Christian theology to take from Marxism. And so it was called liberation theology. To do a kind of theology taking, so they thought, what's good from Marx to build up Christian theology. Well, you can't do that because why is that? Because not every philosophy is equal. It's not the same taking from Aristotle to build up the church's theology as it is from Marx. Because Marx is an absolute materialist. He doesn't think that there's anything more than matter, and the method of social change that he proposes is based on hate and class warfare and division, and so you can't. There's certain things that can't be taken because they're incompatible with truth and goodness. Right? And so we're to take whatever is true and good and put it in the service of God. But whatever is incompatible with that, to leave behind. And that discernment needs to be made in every generation. Right? And it's the same thing it may be with things, secular learning. It could be with the contributions of Christians, non-Catholic Christians. So we want to take what's true and good in those traditions, but not that which would be harmful. Right? And that's a discernment that, we need the Holy Spirit to make that discernment. And the magisterium of the church has that charism to discern. Right? The best example of this would be St. Thomas Aquinas. Right? Taking what's good in that patrimony of Egypt and purifying it, but leaving out what is incompatible. Whereas very often what happens in people who end up outside the church, very often they have the attitude that you can't take anything from secular culture, from classical antiquity. Martin Luther was like that. He had the view that scholasticism, scholastic theology, was bad because it was taking from Aristotle and trying to baptize Aristotle. And he thought, that's blasphemous. But no, that's exactly what Moses did and what God commanded. No, but one has to discern. Or another example, a long time before that, was a great ecclesiastical writer of the 3rd century, Tertullian. It's a magnificent. He was a convert. He wrote the first great works of theology in Latin. He coined terms like the Trinity. But he had, in one of his works, he says, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? Or maybe he said the other, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? And his answer, nothing. And we want to say, in some sense, everything. Because nature and grace aren't in opposition. And Tertullian ended up outside the church. And very often those who oppose philosophy end up outside the church. Changing gears, another part of the typology, the crossing of the Red Sea. So the whole thing is leading up to this. So that the Passover enables them to leave, to begin the leaving of Egypt, but the full leaving of Egypt won't happen until they cross this sea. And it's interesting that the way that God led them was very strange, because he could have led them to either side by which they could have naturally crossed. He should have led them to the north of the Red Sea, one would have thought, which is the normal way you get from Egypt to Israel. But he didn't do that. He led them to a place where they were in some sense locked in by the Red Sea. And when Pharaoh heard about that, he thought, they're dead ducks. They're sitting ducks. And so he comes with his chariots and horsemen and so forth to annihilate them or to bring them back into bondage. But of course, God led them that way so that he could work a miracle. Right? For the same reason that we said he worked the miracle of the 10 plagues. To again impress upon Israel the fact that this is from above. That this isn't they're liberating themselves, right? That's always our tendency, is we want to think that we're the ones who liberate ourselves. And so the very inability of the Israelites to go anywhere from where they'd ended up in the next to the sea with no way to cross it, made it necessary that the salvation be entirely from God, which is all just a figure of our supernatural salvation being entirely from God. So Pharaoh pursues them when he sees them locked in there. And so God uses that to be the occasion of the greatest of the prodigies, the parting of the waves. And so we should think on the literal level that this happened. That it's very fashionable today to think, well, biblical scholars, for the most part, at least those who, too many biblical scholars tend to dismiss the miracles of Egypt, as being legends or something of that sort. But Jewish rabbis, a little parenthesis here. If somebody goes to a rabbi and say they're having trouble with the faith, very often a rabbi will say, look, the miracles of Exodus, it's totally unreasonable to think that they didn't happen. Because how is it that Israel is still here in the world today? When was the last time you met a Jebusite? Or all the other peoples, that the Israelites and the Hittites and all the other ites, that they've all disappeared. And so why is it that Israel alone exists of those peoples? And when you think about it, having existed for 2,000 years, the last 2,000 years, without a land. All right, maybe we can understand how they existed when they had King David and King Solomon. But how have they continued to be a people? Well, the rabbi will say, none of that would have been possible if the miracles of Exodus hadn't occurred. Right? So even though we didn't, because I might say, look, I didn't see any of those miracles. Why should I believe that they happened 3,000, several hundred years ago? Well, we see their consequence. Right? We see their effect in the continued existence of that people. Because how is it that Israel got its faith? Precisely by seeing these prodigies worked by God. Why did they believe him on Mount Sinai? Because they had seen the parting of the Red Sea. And God continually refers to that. No, he's constantly chastising their lack of faith precisely because they'd seen all of those prodigies. And so we can see those prodigies, in a sense, in their effect. And I'm sorry, another parenthesis here. This is more true of Christ's resurrection. Right? If it's true in other words, if we can see the truth of the parting of the Red Sea in the continued existence of Jewish people, well, how much more we can see the resurrection of Christ in the existence of the church. And not just the continued existence, but 1 billion strong. One holy. And it's interesting. Anyway, back to our story. On the literal level, we have to think it happened. And it's absolutely reasonable to think it happened. And it's unreasonable to look at it as some kind of legend. Because that doesn't explain history. Just as thinking of Christ's resurrection as a kind of legend leads to far more questions than it solves them. In other words, we're here today because he truly rose. And likewise, Israel is here today because they went through that Red Sea. All right. So let's look now at the typology, though. So why the passing through the waters? Why was that so important? So God used the passing through the waters to mark the break between the old life in bondage and the new life in liberty. Right? And that was temporal bondage and temporal liberty, but that's a figure of the old life of sin and the new life dedicated to God. And of course, Israel's life wasn't simply temporal freedom. It was a life in the desert that only had one purpose, really: the worship given to God. And that's, if you think, that's when Moses went to Pharaoh and asked, "Let my people free." Why did he? What was the reason that he gave?
Sacrifice.
Right, so they could offer sacrifice on the holy mountain to God. Right? And so Israel was, yes, it was freed from temporal bondage, but so it could live unto God. Right? But it had to pass through the waters first. So what is this a figure of? Obviously, baptism. Right? The passing through the Red Sea is the great type of baptism as the passing from the life of bondage into the life dedicated to God, to the life of grace. And then the very fact that the Egyptians pursue them, that's part of the type. Right? So the Egyptians see the path opened up and, let us go through. And what happens? Moses strikes the waves again from the other side. The waters return, and every charioteer is swept away by the waves and ends up in carnage on the other side, dead and unable to pursue them. Now, somebody, again, my father-in-law always gets indignant. What about those poor Egyptians? But they're a type of sin. They're a type of sin and the bondage that comes to us from sin. And we want to see them, as it were, powerless to continue to pursue us. And so the very fact that they tried to pursue, but it was precisely the waters that washed us clean of them and washed them from having power over us. All of that is a type of what actually happens in every baptism. Right? In every baptism, sin which has pursued us, and especially it's harder to see in infant baptism. There's original sin there that's pursuing them, but it's more dramatic in adult baptism. Most of you probably witnessed a baptism in the Easter Vigil. At the cathedral, there were, 6 adult baptisms last Saturday night. And so we should think that sin pursues someone until at that moment of baptism, all the sins of a person's life are rendered unable to pursue them any further and are washed and rendered powerless over them. All of them, right? Every single one. And so all of this was planned by God to be a type of what baptism works in us. And so the charioteers representing sin, and Pharaoh, the head of the charioteers, representing Satan. Right? And so in baptism, there's the rite of the renunciation of Satan and his works, right? Which corresponds to Pharaoh and his charioteers. And in the early church, it was more dramatic than it is today. In the early church, at the renunciation of Satan, there would be a directional thing. Well, we talked about that in an earlier talk. That you would turn to the west. That's the sunset, the place of death, as it were, is the direction of Satan. And they would spit at him, liturgical spitting, and renounce him and then turn to the east, to Christ, to profess the creed and be baptized. And so the passage through the Red Sea represents the same directions. Right? So Egypt is to the west of Israel. Right? And so in some sense it corresponds to the direction of Satan, obviously. I'm not saying that Egyptians are... It's a typology. And it's the typology precisely that doesn't lead us to say that any one people is... in other words, it's a type of something that's in every man. So I've given you various texts of the fathers here. So the fathers of the church love this typology, and in their catecheses for Easter, they always bring out the typology of the crossing of the Red Sea. So, for example, Tertullian, that I mentioned before, who ended badly, in his homily on baptism, he says, "When the people of Israel are set free from bondage in Egypt and passing through the water, are escaping the violence of the Egyptian king, the king himself, with all his forces, is destroyed by water." This is a type made abundantly clear in the sacred act of baptism. I mean that the Gentiles are set free from this present world by means of water and leave behind, drowned in the water, their ancient tyrant, the devil. And not only Gentiles, but everyone who's baptized. St. Augustine develops the same typology. The people, he says, according to the Old Testament, are liberated from Egypt. The people, according to the New Testament, are liberated from the devil. Just as the Egyptians pursued the Jews as far as the sea, so Christians are pursued by their sins as far as baptism. Observe, brothers, and see. Through the sea, the Jews are liberated. In the sea, the Egyptians are overwhelmed. Through baptism, Christians are liberated and quit of their sins, while their sins are destroyed. Those ones come out after the Red Sea and journey through the desert. So too Christians after baptism are not yet in the promised land. And so after they cross the Red Sea, what do they have to do? Wander for 40 years before getting to the promised land. And just about all of them died before they got there, except for Joshua and Caleb. Even Moses had to die before they got to the promised land. And that's also a type. No, that's a type that baptism isn't the end of the road. Baptism, crossing through the waters of the Red Sea, the waters of baptism, is the beginning of the road. But it brings us to what? To the desert. The desert of trial and temptation, which is the essence of the Christian life. It's a good trial because they're journeying, in some sense, the time in the desert was a golden time in retrospect. Right? Because it was the time when the people were, in some sense, most dedicated to God. But as they were doing it, it seemed like a time of constant trial and murmuring and temptation. And so it is for us. So St. Augustine develops that. He says, this age, the time of the church, these past 2,000 years, is the desert. And desert it is indeed for Christians after baptism, if they understand what they've received. In other words, if we understand what we received in baptism, then yes, we'll see this life will in some sense be a desert because we're recognizing that we're for something else, that we're not made for this world. They will understand that they are living as wandering exiles, longing for their native land. In another homily, St. Augustine says, this people of God, freed from a great and broad Egypt, is led as through the Red Sea, that in baptism it may make an end of its enemies. For by the sacrament, as it were, of the Red Sea, that is by baptism, consecrated with the blood of Christ, the pursuing Egyptians, their sins are washed away. Finally, St. John Chrysostom, one of the great fathers at the same time as St. Augustine, Greek father, he explained to the catechumens on the Easter Vigil, in his homily, he says, the Israelites witnessed marvels. You also will witness marvels, greater and more splendid than those which accompanied them on their departure from Egypt. And this is true of every one of us. Each one of us has experienced a marvel immeasurably greater than the historical marvel of the parting of the Red Sea. Right? And that marvel is our own baptism. Because in the parting of the Red Sea, they just walked through a sea and went from one country to another. But in our baptism, we receive supernatural life, the life of God. A life infinitely above what's due to us by human nature. Right? And so we've received greater marvels. The problem is we don't tend to think so. You did not see Pharaoh drowned with his armies, but you have seen the devil with his weapons overcome by the waters of baptism. The Israelites passed through the sea. You have passed from death to life. He's preaching this to the newly baptized, not the ones who were just baptized in that ceremony. They were delivered from the Egyptians. You have been delivered from the powers of darkness. The Israelites were freed from slavery to a pagan people. You have been freed from the much greater slavery to sin. And so this is why in the Easter Vigil, Mass, we read that text of the crossing of the Red Sea from Exodus 15. And even if you have to skip some reading, you shouldn't skip that reading. And it's perfectly suited to being the occasion of the solemn reception of baptism. And so the Christian life is the life that follows from passing through that Red Sea, and therefore the life of the desert, being fed by the manna. Right? So in the desert, their food was from above, the bread from heaven, and likewise in the Christian life, our food is the Eucharist, but in the midst of temptation. Right? And that temptation is good for us to prove our dedication to God and to be the vehicle of our growth. I'm going to skip the last part of this talk in here. So let's take a break and then questions and answers.